Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor at conter.co.uk. Just bringing you another video today talking about the independence movement in Wales with Seb Cook, who is the editor of an excellent left-wing website based in Wales, which is called Voice.Wales. Seb, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoy the YouTube channel and what you guys are doing over in Conter.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, I suppose I really wanted to speak to someone in Wales about Yes Cymru and about the wider independence movement in that country. Especially because I feel like now there's a bit of a dialogue between the two independence movements in Scotland and in Wales. Especially after Yes Cymru, I see it's recently reached just about 20,000 sign-ups. So this is a non-party, pro-independence campaigning organisation. The question seems to have really come alive again in Wales in the last couple of years. So yeah, just first of all, what are the origins of the independence movement in Wales? What's its sort of political backdrop?
I think, it's the first thing to say is it's a very exciting time in Wales at the moment in terms of the independence movement. I mean, I've lived here all my life, went to school and college and things, and there's never been a kind of a moment like this in terms of support for independence. And I think that's both in terms of kind of hard support, like you say, in terms of membership of Yes Cymru, which is really the central kind of organising, a central organisation, I suppose, mobilising for Welsh independence. I think the figure might be knocking 16,000, not 20,000. I'm not sure, but maybe they've piled on another 5,000.
I was sure I saw that on the website. Maybe I'm doing a bit of propaganda for
I thought I saw something on Twitter today that said 15,800, but I'm not sure. Either way, there's been a massive surge of support, and I think that's happened through the pandemic, and the kind of you see the sort of British establishment getting a little bit more scared of it as well. And I think it kind of the left in Wales, who maybe traditionally didn't really relate to the Welsh independence movement much, because it was kind of on the fringes, should take it seriously, engage, and kind of support a lot of its kind of central aims, and definitely not dismiss it, because I think it's quite a good political atmosphere at the moment for the left and socialists in Wales. A lot of the politics around the independence movement is very kind of progressive, anti-Tory, generally in favour of things like more wealth distribution, against the kind of racist, anti-immigration policies of people like Priti Patel. And I think kind of more broadly as well, it's almost creating a sort of sense of kind of political rebellion or political dissent against kind of Westminster rule, dare I say it, almost a kind of populist kind of backlash, if you like, against Westminster, which again has been heightened during the pandemic. And I think that's quite welcome, and something that a lot of people on the left within the Labour movement and the trade union movement can kind of get behind. And that's something which really has happened, particularly over the last year, but I would say, in earnest as well over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, kind of for years, the Welsh independence movement was something which was, speaking honestly, probably something quite on the fringes of Welsh politics. Wasn't something that often related to a kind of the material interest of people on a sort of wide scale, and was kind of rooted, I would say, a lot in kind of the sort of mythology of Welsh national kind of struggles. Where you're going back to kind of the 12th century, the 13th century, where you have kind of big national figures like Prince Llewellyn and people like Owen Glendower, who kind of led rebellions against kind of English rule. And I think those are the things that it was often, I suppose, talking about. And then in the 20th century, the Welsh independence movement, you really see a kind of a new struggle erupt around kind of the struggle around the Welsh language. You see, in response to a kind of suppression of the Welsh language and Welsh culture, particularly in education, but also in the workplace. And then also, in the 20th century, and especially after the war, you see Wales kind of used in terms of its resources as well, kind of natural resources, water is used by the MOD. I think even today the Ministry of Defence might be the biggest landowner in Wales. And you see kind of not only big struggles around the Welsh language, but also big struggles against the kind of flooding of Welsh villages, for reservoirs, against, with no kind of consultation, and a kind of attack on, sort of what people see as kind of traditional Welsh culture and Welsh communities. And then you have a referendum for devolution in that period in the 70s, which is unsuccessful, which is kind of seen as a bit of a defeat for the Welsh independence movement, or the Welsh nationalist movement. And then it's kind of, you've got the successful referendum for devolution in 1999. And I think throughout that kind of period, you would be right in saying that the Welsh independence movement, or the Welsh nationalist movement, was not something which kind of dominated political culture. I mean, I remember in 2011 or 12, there was a story in the Welsh press about, a press officer or kind of worker for Plaid Cymru, the sort of Welsh Nationalist Party, who was seen at a kind of, festival, not festival, or sort of ritual event at the kind of death place of Prince Llewellyn, and, you looked at the picture in the paper and someone was sort of holding an axe or something like that. And it wasn't kind of necessarily, like I say, relating to kind of, wider political questions within Welsh society. And I would say that's really kind of shifted. That's kind of where it was, I suppose, 5 or 6 years ago. And I think that's really started to shift. But I think the way it started to shift, or part of the reason it started to shift, is just a kind of deep sense of political antagonism and anger towards, the breakdown of kind of the economic settlement that we've seen, neoliberalism over the past 30, 40 years, the kind of consensus around austerity. And when that was broken, I really think, partly by the Yes campaign in Scotland, and then the kind of anti-austerity politics, which kind of emerged a bit in the 2015 election around Plaid Cymru, the Green Party, obviously the SNP, then which kind of got absorbed into Corbynism, plus the kind of big struggle for independence in Catalonia, in a way that was really pitted against the kind of Spanish state, and really sort of took on, similarly to how it was in Scotland, questions about eradicating poverty in society, wealth distribution, a less aggressive foreign policy. I think that kind of, and even in a kind of contradictory way, the questions around democracy and sovereignty, which emerged around Brexit as well, I think have kind of changed the dynamic now. And you can almost write a new history of the Welsh independence movement from that point, where it suddenly started to look like it's relating at a much broader level to material issues in people's lives, and looks to people like it poses much more of a serious challenge to a political establishment, which I think a lot of people in Wales rightly see has completely failed them. In terms of economics and things. I think that's kind of that kind of brings us to where we are now in terms of the pandemic. And this year again, like I say, has been another game changer.
I mean, that reminds me a lot of developments in Scotland. You sometimes get a view, particularly from kind of media based in London and so on, as though national questions in countries like Scotland and Wales are sort of primordial, always threatening to erupt, as though there's a sort of bloody-mindedness about sort of small nationalities that are always determined to push the national question. But in most of my lifetime, the national question in Scotland was extremely marginal to events. And people who were very interested in it, people who saw it as their political priority, were typically considered as, eccentrics. If you grew up in the kind of Labour voting majority of Scotland, they were seen as kind of not even necessarily regressive, just sort of silly. Just like this is nonsense. It's a silly idea. But yes, it's when after Thatcherism, and then on after that. Sort of New Labour dissolved the Labour Party and the Labour tradition as an effective sort of counter-hegemony to the Conservatives. After the Iraq War, after Ed Miliband signed up to austerity and so on, it destroyed any residual faith in the mechanisms of the British state to provide people with a voice, to provide people with a say in how they were governed, of any even limited sort. And that's when Scottish independence became this huge vehicle for collecting together a lot, lots of different strands, some of them more nationalist, some of them more kind of social democratic, some of them just sort of anti-politics, you know what I mean, a kind of populist anti-politics, those sorts of sentiments. So, given that, I mean, is that a similar mix in Wales, and how should socialists in Wales intervene into that situation?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it is a similar dynamic, and I think kind of a lot of the time you get, the question of democracy in Wales is posed quite sharply, particularly because Wales in a sort of general election, in a Westminster election, has never voted for a Tory government, but you get a Tory government, and you get the closing of the mines, and you get austerity. That's not something people voted for, and I think kind of those things have really fueled the, I guess, the desire for democracy, the desire for representation, and the desire to put in place policies which go against the sort of logic of the last 30, 40 years, in terms of increasing privatization and increasing the amount of profits going to a very small number of people. And I think kind of there's a way of looking at Welsh history which is quite narrow in a way, and like you say, does revert to a kind of simple kind of nationalist struggle, whereas actually if you look at the kind of, I would say, the biggest rebellions in terms of Welsh history, they're sort of rebellions of farm workers, the working class, the Chartists, the Rebecca riots, the Merthyr Rising, and then kind of massive strikes in the first part of the 20th century, and then obviously the miners' strike in the latter half of the 20th century. And I think sometimes these are kind of ignored or kind of overlooked as kind of big parts in Welsh history, because they put the question of class politics completely central to Welsh society, and they get in the way of an argument that says, or gets in the way of an argument of a kind of that wants to look for a sort of quite a simple kind of nationalist struggle between England and Wales, or between Wales and England. And I think, like I say, I think that's kind of the dynamic in that sense has really shifted recently, as you've seen the kind of crisis within the system as a whole get much more serious and much more severe. You've also seen kind of struggles on the other side, class struggle as well, come into it, and I think that's kind of fed into the independence movement.
Let me ask then about Yes Cymru as a development, because I think in a funny kind of way, Wales has been more at the crossroads of some of the recent political antagonisms than Scotland has. So Corbynism never really got much of a following in Scotland, for example. Because because such large elements of Scottish society had already swung behind the independence question after 2014, that turned the Brexit referendum into a sort of another referendum on Scottish self-determination. So obviously Scotland was one of the parts of the UK where the vote for Remain was the biggest, 62%. Whereas Wales still seems to be, in a sense, there's much more obviously contradictory pressures in play in Welsh society. So Corbynism was relatively, was sort of re-energised some of the kind of country's Labourite traditions. You had the country voted to leave the European Union as well. And also the Welsh Parliament has had representation from sort of pro-Brexit parties and so on. And Scotland hasn't really had that except for one MEP. How does the independence question fit in that mix? Is it sort of triumphing out of the ashes of some of those other projects?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important to start in 2014 and to look at the effect that the Yes campaign had on the Welsh independence movement, which I think was quite massive, because in that time, like you say, there was a kind of political census by and large around the question of austerity. And I think what you did in Scotland, and particularly the kind of radical independence campaign, which I know you're involved in Scotland, putting the question of class quite central, putting the question of kind of how do we change society, how do we challenge neoliberalism quite centrally, I think really shifted the dynamic. And I think that had come on the back of some kind of extra parliamentary struggles. Before that, you had the students in 2011. There was a couple of strikes in Britain, but not many. There's organisations like UK Uncut. There was a sort of a lid was kept on the anti-austerity movement. I think that was there in that period before that, but Yes kind of broke out of that and kind of lifted the lid on it. And after that, lots of things kind of changed. And I think that sort of the effect it had on the independence movement in Wales was, on one hand, it kind of made the independence campaigners in Wales, if you like, or people who already kind of signed up to that or saw that as their kind of primary sort of political motivation, suddenly saw that if you wanted to be successful, if you wanted to kind of get to the point where you look like you're on the brink of achieving independence, you would need to relate to people on a much wider level, and you would need to try and kind of energize working class people and working class voters in quite a serious way. But I think what it also did is it made people who were maybe sort of less aware of the question of independence in Wales, or didn't really see it as relevant, suddenly saw that a struggle over independence, like you had in Scotland, could actually promote some things which would kind of make their lives better and challenge the people that they weren't so keen on. I think kind of what you say about Corbyn's quite interesting, because Corbyn's quite a contradictory experience in Wales in some ways. There was quite big support for Corbyn, I think, here. There was both in terms of, there was a big surge in terms of Labour Party membership, in a similar way to you're seeing with Yes Cymru now. There was lots of people that kind of went in and came into Labour in Wales. In the election in 2017, there were quite big rallies. And in the election, Labour actually took seats off the Tories that they were expecting to lose. And Welsh Labour went into the 2017 election with a strategy of just saying, let's try and keep on to the seats we've already got. Whereas a lot of people like me were saying, actually, I think we can win seats off the Tories, because if we come in on the back of these quite serious kind of political arguments, left-wing sort of radical economic arguments that Corbyn's putting forward, we might be able to mobilise people to take seats off the Tories. And we did. Labour took a number, I'm not a Labour member, by the way, but Labour took a number of seats off the Tories in 2017. But the logic of kind of Welsh Labourism and the sort of electoral logic of Labourism at large, and a desire for kind of unity with Welsh Labour, really sort of kept Corbynism at bay in a lot of ways and kept a kind of lid on it. There was a desire kind of not to rock the boat. And where you see sort of confrontations between the Labour left and the Labour right in England, those didn't really kind of explode in the same way in Wales. And because, Welsh Labour is very much the political establishment in Wales, they've been in power ever since devolution happened, there was kind of no sense, or there was less of a sense of a confrontation with the political establishment than there might have been in parts of England, because Welsh Labour were the political establishment. And whenever Corbyn was asked about, Wales, he would usually just say, well, Welsh Labour is doing a great job, which isn't really the experience of a lot of people in Wales. And you would have the strange spectre of, Labour under Corbyn producing policies that were more to the left than what Welsh Labour were actually putting in Wales. So there was a kind of a contradiction, and I think that led to a sort of suspicious, well, not suspicious, but a scepticism amongst a lot of the independence movement about Corbynism, which in some ways was rooted in the idea that Labour's a unionist party, so why would we back a kind of left-wing? Why would we back a Labour leader? But also, I think because of those elements, those contradictions I talked about with Welsh Labour. And I think in turn, kind of, a lot of sort of left-wing Labour supporters in that period maybe saw independence as a bit of as a bit of a distraction maybe, and not something which was kind of, you know, the main way with which you were going to challenge the British establishment, the main way with which you were going to challenge neoliberalism. And I think both really, in retrospect, could have seen each other as a challenge to the status quo, and used each other and used the dynamics of each other to try and grow support into what I think both need to do, which is to challenge the British state and to challenge British capitalism. Just on the question of Brexit, again, there's another contradiction, because I mean, the Welsh independence movement, by and large, and I suppose the political party that it's, you know, always been associated with, Plaid Cymru, were very much in favour of Remain, both going into the referendum and indeed and after the referendum. You know, they kind of were, you know, one of the kind of biggest voices, I guess, to try and push for a second referendum and make this a kind of central political question. And this led to quite a lot of confusion, I think, within the independence movement, some of which I think still persists today. So one of the things you still get now is the idea that, you know, Wales voted for a majority to leave the EU because of English retirees or kind of English leavers that have kind of come over, and it's them who've kind of created this. You know, they're these kind of flag-waving British nationalists who love the monarch and love the Queen, and they're nostalgic of empire, and that's what happened. And I think what that was really about was there was a real failure to understand the dynamics of the kind of Brexit vote in Wales, which presented, you know, problems not just for the independence movement, but also the left as well. I mean, obviously Corbynism, you know, completely mistreated this question after the election in 2017. You know, went full down the kind of Remain angle, and it sort of ended in absolute disaster. And I think, you know, I think it's important just to kind of, you know, think about the Leave vote in Wales and what were some of the reasons behind it, because I think there were two main elements. And I think the first one, which I certainly picked up a lot, was a kind of popular rejection of the status quo, you know, anger at kind of ruling class figureheads, and particularly David Cameron, on austerity. You know, there was palpable anger. One study I think I even read after the referendum of the Electoral Reform Society said that David Cameron was the politician who was most likely to make people vote Leave, in the sense that most people's, you know, in terms of when they're thinking about a politician, it was mostly a negative vote against Cameron rather than it was a positive vote for Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage. And people, you know, I interviewed people at the time, and a lot of people just didn't buy the idea that the EU was of any benefit to them. I mean, the whole political establishment in Wales backed Remain, and a lot of them were saying, you know, not only is life kind of better, but the EU has given things, you know, even the EU has built a new road, or it's built a new centre, or it's kind of, you know, done these kind of things. And you kind of speak to people in these areas, and they would say, you know, well, areas in the valleys, you know, or a lot of the kind of smaller towns in Wales, and they would look around and they'd say, well, there used to be a cinema here, there used to be 3 pubs, there used to be, you know, concerts on a Saturday night, you know, there used to be good paying jobs. All of that has just disappeared now. All of that is gone. And then you've got a Welsh political establishment, just like the kind of, a lot of the kind of British as well, saying, you know, that the EU is of a benefit to them, and people just didn't really buy it. And I think the second part to the vote was that people often blamed kind of immigrants and migration for some of these things, a kind of lack of jobs and services, and it almost became a kind of common sense thing, you know, which obviously is on the back of kind of anti-immigration politics from sort of New Labour and the Tories for decades, where people thought, well, you know, of course we can't, you know, there's only a limited number of spaces at my local GP surgery, so if more people come in, then of course everyone's getting an appointment. And that became very predominant and pervasive. And I think there was a kind of a failure to engage with the vote and kind of engage with the first part of that in terms of the rejection establishment, in order to actually challenge the second part, in order to challenge anti-immigration politics, in order to challenge people away from racism. And I think, you know, what that did is it kind of negated the severity of the sort of social crisis in Wales, which is just huge. You know, just last night there was a tweet from the Welsh Ambulance Service saying, you know, you might have to wait longer than usual tonight because we're very busy. You know, this is on the back of just years of like absolutely savage Welsh NHS cuts. You know, you've got councils which have got huge kind of black holes in their funding. You've got services absolutely decimated. And a lot of the kind of stuff around austerities kind of come off the back of already kind of, pits closing and mining jobs that used to be there. And in that period, the kind of indie movement and, the left as well just didn't really contest that space at all, didn't contest that kind of anti-establishment politics. It just kind of dismissed it. And I just want to give you one example. I went recently to do an interview in a town in the valleys, which is quite typical of a lot of towns in the valleys, for a piece of voice about kind of political opinions. And I met this woman who just had a baby on the street. She's pushing her 1-year-old child in a pram, and she said that she'd recently lost her job. She worked at a low-paid job in a local manufacturing factory. She had some complications with her pregnancy, so she effectively got sacked before she got maternity pay. She's now on universal credit and has to kind of rely mostly on her partner for her income. And I asked her about the kind of political dynamic, and she said that she'd always been a Plaid Cymru voter, but then when she moved to this town, the way she described it, everyone in her street voted to leave the EU. Just everyone did. And then she ended up voting for the Brexit Party in the 2019 elections because she was so angry about the idea of the vote being overturned. But when I asked her, would you vote for Welsh independence, she said yes. And the question that really seemed to be sort of concerning her most was the idea of, democracy, the idea of, people making decisions, where they are that affect their lives, I suppose. And I think the fact that the left has kind of, or the indie movement has kind of left some of those people behind in some ways, has kind of, opened up a space where the right started to dominate Welsh politics. So in the 2019 EU elections, you see the Brexit Party topping the poll, one of the first times ever that Labour didn't top a national poll in Wales. And obviously the 2019 election result where, yes, Labour still kind of won the vote in Wales in the 2019 election. But, if you look at, how parties were doing before the election and how they did after the election, I mean, undoubtedly the Tories, won that election in Wales, took a number of seats off Labour. And I think what that process really did is it kind of was a bit of a wake-up call, to the kind of, to the left, but also, to the kind of independence movement over the question of Brexit. And I think since then there's a separation between Yes Cymru and Plaid Cymru. And I think had Yes Cymru kind of really hung their hat on Remain, they would have felt a bit of defeat from the 2019 election as well. I think the fact that they didn't means that they, unlike the kind of left and around Corbyn, who were completely defeated in the 2019 election, the independence movement has been able to come out of it, relatively unscathed, but also has been able to kind of tap into the, or kind of tap into the defeat of Corbynism in some way, in the sense that people, aren't looking that there's going to be a sort of socialist, anti-imperialist leader of the Labour Party that could potentially be a prime minister and really shake things up. And now they see a vehicle for those kind of things through Welsh independence, and I think it's kind of it's done that as well. And I think it's what you see is it's being able to tap into the independence movement, has been able to tap into anti-establishment sentiment and class politics, quite well recently. But I think also just finally, I think there's also there's a move also at the same time towards being more acceptable to the kind of Welsh business, to the Welsh establishment as well, in order to achieve independence.
Let me ask you.
I think sorry, just going to say the legacy of the last 4 years is kind of that contradiction in some ways.
No, I just wanted to intervene there because I wanted to say that, this has been the experience in Scotland. So obviously throughout the 2012 to 2014 independence referendum, I mean, the independence movement moved to the left a lot during that campaign. Its rhetoric shifted ground quite considerably. I mean, the official Yes campaign was launched as a sort of corporate, celebrity-laden tradition. I mean, it looked a lot like the Better Together campaign in many regards, basically, led by business figures and things like that. But it became clear that the support for independence only started to gain legs once it started talking about the NHS, about austerity, about Trident, about kind of the big social questions that people in Scotland faced, inequality and child poverty and so on. But since 2014 and the hegemony of the SNP and the independence movement and so on, the leadership of the SNP have moved the pitch of the government and their party, and by extension the independence movement, much more to the right. So in recent years, we've seen the rise of a new kind of economic outlook at the top of the SNP, which stresses continuity on a range of levels with the British state. We continue to use the pound, but without any access to monetary policy. A bizarre idea. We'd be sharing London's financial regulation, which has caused so much chaos in recent decades. We would remain in NATO. Actually, that was a decision taken at the SNP conference in 2012. On so many registers, the party leadership has moved and realigned independence, with a more kind of centrist political attitude. The European Union was important in that respect as well. It was made clear that there's almost an attempt to say, well, Westminster's gone rogue, but Scotland's going to be like a normal country, a normal, well-behaving European country. Now, so just on those terms, I mean, how are people in the independence movement in Wales going to combat those institutional pressures? I mean, we know what's going on here. That in a sense, it's similar to other types of reformism, where the leadership of the movement is a transmission belt for sort of moving the pressures from the external institutional life of capitalism back into the social movement. It's not even that these people like Nicola Sturgeon has a particularly strong ideological trajectory. It's just that as far as she's concerned, independence is only possible if Scotland becomes an extremely well-behaved member of the international community, so-called. And that means signing up to complete conformity with a suite of institutions which would ultimately remove huge amounts of sovereignty and democracy from Scotland itself. Are you seeing those same sorts of tensions in the Welsh movement, and how are they combated?
Yeah, 100%. I think that there's you see a lot of that dynamic existing within the Welsh independence movement, and I think there's almost kind of the success of the movement in terms of its membership, or Yes Cymru in terms of its membership, has is almost heightening some of those contradictions and some of those dynamics. And I think, throughout 2020, you've seen in the pandemic a real kind of surge in support for Yes Cymru. You've seen, especially around kind of the start of the pandemic, around herd immunity, and then around the whole thing with Dominic Cummings, and then recently around some of the regulations. You've seen, that's when you've seen the big spikes in a surge of support. And, in terms of the base of the movement, which I think is quite relevant to your question, we did a few interviews with some of the new recruits from the movement and some of the kind of people who were interested in it. And it was very kind of, very political, quite kind of anti-Tory. I think one person worked for like a care home, and it was at the start of the pandemic, and they just said, this Tory government is just going to let people die. They're just going to kill people with COVID because they just don't care about them. They'd rather put profit first. They'd rather put the economy first. And this had kind of driven, this person, to wanting to join the Welsh independence movement, because they thought, that's going to give us a chance to build a fairer society, to build a more equal society, and to build a society that puts a human life above the pursuit of profit. And in a way, it's kind of similar to some of the things you heard. I heard from sort of Corbyn supporters in an election in 2017, but framed in a slightly different way. And I think kind of, you look at the Welsh independence movement. Some of I think where it's been most exciting has been kind of some of the big marches it had last year, where it kind of went to different parts of Wales, not kind of just sort of the biggest towns or cities, but kind of all sorts of different areas, working class areas. In one march, it was going to translate its leaflets into Polish, because in Wrexham, which actually got called off because of the pandemic, there's a big Polish community there. And you saw kind of like in marches in Merthyr, I think about, I don't know how many people, 1,000 plus, lots of kind of working class support for the idea of independence. And I think that's kind of really fed into, the success of where it is as a movement now. And I think a lot of what Yes Cymru puts out, reflects that kind of mood at the base. And it kind of, like I say, it's kind of got this sort of like rebellious sort of anti-Tory edge to it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it also now faces kind of massive pressures from the Welsh establishment and Welsh business to try and be more acceptable, and to try and kind of not have a major confrontation with the British state. Which you saw, I suppose, kind of most viscerally in Catalonia. An absolute kind of savage response from the Spanish state. And I think that's not just in terms of Welsh business, it's also the Labour right. I mean, the Welsh Labour right, I mean, I don't know whether they've, learned the sort of lessons of disastrous, fate of Labour in Scotland, but there's a lot of figures kind of, who pro-war, quite hawkish, who are kind of making noises and trying to be quite friendly to the independence movement. And like you say, framing it in this question of, Brexit is purely a kind of English nationalist thing. It's an aberration. We need to kind of get back to being a responsible country. We need to kind of be a small country within the EU as part of a bigger sort of global kind of military alliance, in terms of NATO and things like that. And that's kind of, one element of the pressure. And I think kind of has a sort of certain level of traction, because people think, well, if these people accept it, then, maybe then we can try and achieve it as well. But it's also in terms of Welsh businesses. I mean, there's these kind of, like I suppose in any nationalist movement, competing class interests, which will become more prominent. There was one, Welsh entrepreneur did an interview with, Adam Price, the leader of Plaid Cymru, and he said that, he basically wanted independent Wales to be able to cut corporation tax. And I think recently the same person has talked about, Wales being like Ireland pre-crash, the Celtic Tiger, just get the business in, deregulation, get the economy booming. Who cares if it's going to kind of, sink in a decade or something. And I think, there's a lot of, elements of the Welsh kind of ruling class, or you might say it as kind of the Welsh section of the British ruling class, or Welsh business, who would see a real opportunity in Wales to kind of get, very rich and take advantage of a kind of a different sort of political settlement. And I think kind of these pressures, they have led to some political difficulties within the independence movement, and a kind of reticence almost to kind of take on sort of big political questions, because they've got this big membership, and I guess maybe there's a desire to try and keep things kind of moving forward without kind of rocking the boat too much. And I saw this, when Welsh nurses kind of, with nurses from across Britain took to the streets for a 15% pay rise after the pandemic. And I didn't really get a sense that Yes Cymru, in terms of leadership, were particularly keen in trying to support that movement or try and kind of get behind it. It was only kind of smaller elements of the Welsh independence movement, Undod Cymru, Values Underground, these kind of radical independence campaigns that actually saw that as key. And even, Black Lives Matter on a far bigger scale, which really sort of shook Welsh politics to its core, like it did everywhere, put the question of racism central. It also kind of, really highlighted, Welsh involvement in the slave trade, Welsh industrialist involvement in empire and colonialism, and kind of gave a completely different reading to what we usually get about Welsh history, as well as mobilising just, thousands of people in cities and towns across Wales, obviously led by Black and brown people, but also, had demonstrations in areas that are kind of 95 to 99% white as well. It was one of the biggest social movements Wales has probably ever seen. And again, I think Yes Cymru sort of had some criticism for not putting out a statement quick enough around it. They were sort of reticent to sort of throw themselves behind it again, it seemed to a lot of people. And I think it kind of comes back to this question of they sort of think, oh, well, we don't really want to, focus on these other political issues or these wider political issues. And, if we just have a sole focus on the question of independence with this kind of coalition of people and these kind of competing class interests, we can somehow kind of get over the line. And I think the danger is that can start to look quite abstract to people and not really relate to their kind of material lives. I mean, even, one of the big arguments in the Welsh independence movement is over the question of resources, because, Wales, I think, produces more energy than it uses in terms of its natural resources, and it's certainly got capacity into wave energy, offshore wind, to do even more. But you don't often get the sense or the conversation about the need for democratic control of those resources, the need for democratic ownership and nationalisation and public ownership. And I think, the danger there is that the movement, in that sense, can start to get weaker, and it can be forced into making big concessions to what it sees as a kind of in return for independence. And I think those are, over questions around, the treatment of business, corporation tax, and also, also militarily. I mean, there'll be an argument in the Welsh independence movement, or if it ever gets close, I suppose, to kind of keep a sort of a military tie to Britain. You can almost see something being where we're sort of nominally independent, but we're tied into a 30-year deal or something with the British military, so they continue to use, have their military bases in Wales, continue to have loads of air ranges in Wales, continue to use air bases in Anglesey, and all the rest of it, because the argument will be, well, we've got to be a responsible nation, and we've also got, kind of typical arguments around national security. And I think, it's going to be a big disappointment if an independent Wales, looks like that. Basically, it looks like just a kind of another standard country, and possibly even with a more competitive corporate tax market and labour market than the rest of the UK. But I think sometimes, some of these questions maybe are slightly inevitable if you kind of hide the question of capitalism, if you hide the question of kind of true democracy, and you kind of hide the question of class relationships. And I think, we're yet to see the Welsh independence movement come under a kind of big political test in the way that, Yes did in Scotland. And by that, I mean the kind of political test of really facing kind of the ferocity of the British ruling class against the idea of independence, which will obviously happen if it looks like independence is close, but also that it looks like it might actually pose a challenge to British capitalism more general, like it might inspire people in England to take to the streets, and people in England to kind of fight for their own lives and things like that. So yeah, I think it's kind of it's there's all those things sort of going on, really.
Okay, Seb, thanks very much for those thoughts. I'll look forward to reading more about this on Voice.Wales, and we'll presumably be having more of these conversations in the coming months. So thanks very much for that.
No worries, thanks for having me on. It's been great. Cheers.
And we'll keep covering those issues on conta.co.uk. A very interesting time for national questions and independence movements across the UK. And so, yeah, we'll keep covering those. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel for more videos, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.